Hello and welcome to today's webinar.
Today we're talking about the Azure migrate and security related to migration. We will mention a few things, but first just a brief introduction. My name is Sasha, and I'm Azure and Security MVP as well, a certified trainer for a long time, and Regional Lead too, but I also do security courses and CompTIA courses too. Anyway, let's jump to our migration overview. Before we start with the security part, let's just see few essential steps in migration. What the essential step in every migration should be. So first of all, the successful migration comprises of numerous steps. The first one would be assessing each workload's technical fit. What it is, it means that we have to validate the technical readiness and suitability for migration, as well as we have to identify some crucial points in between everything else. We should identify the security pain points as well. Here we won't talk about the other successful migration characteristics like cost, performance, and everything. And yes, these are maybe not directly tied to security, but indirectly as well. We need to focus on these things too, because improper implementation often tends to also reflect onto the weaker security. Unnecessary, for example, we might have unnecessary services deployed in Azure based on our wrong assumption, or we might even miss some what's even worse, or I don't know which is worse, but the worst thing is that that we are weakening security in any case. So assessing each workload technical fit would be the first step. And here we have different tools, first party tools, third party tools, and I suggest that you use multiple tools as well as your personal judgment, and then combine every tool and your personal judgment, and then make a decision, because you are the only one who knows how exactly these products, the infrastructure performs, what are the characteristics, how you're using these, what workloads are running, and so on. The tools that you have will only assess, yes, it is a valid point, will assess the CPU or the utilization and all the hardware aspects, even if we have a tool that might assess the simple utilization or give us the like migration tool stars of suitability for migrating or readiness, then I think we are the admins should have the last word to it. And then we have to migrate the services that we identified, and it is not just migrating services. We need to perform some initial steps in Azure as well, and that means also incorporate some landing zones, for example, prepare for security, think of upfront for security, and that means subscriptions and network security groups, security appliances, and so on. It is a complex process that should incorporate the old saying that 80% of planning and 20% of execution should be applied. And this is not just valid for Azure, but every aspect of our life. So we are implementing that here as well in Azure. So 80% of planning, 20% of execution will mean that we are at the end ending up more secure or in a less costly environment. And then afterwards, we manage, of course, cost and billing and fine-tuning our migration and so on. After that, we are optimizing and promoting the workload to production, so optimizing for cost and performance and balance. And I should say also the security here as well. Well, the security shouldn't be just in the fourth stage like this, but at every stage we should think about the security. And then, of course, there's get assistance. It always means that you identify any experts in migration or whatever for whatever product you might have that can assist you in further securing or optimizing or making the excellence state of the art of your infrastructure in Azure that you have just moved. But let's get a bigger overview of migration, which is just an example with a vCenter server, for example, where we will configure the appliance, start discovery, then get the metadata and process that metadata and migrate that these workloads, and then make an assessment of these workloads before we actually migrate and after migration as well. And that is also a very sensitive operation, because we need to store the data as well somewhere. We have that data that is very sensitive, meaning the description of all our assets. For example, I had the experience working in a company that actually have been breached, and the CSV files and all the documentation for moving migrating to Azure was leaked actually, and they had very nasty problems after that. So that should be the first thing to do. But before we actually move anything, we should consider the Azure landing zones. So what are in fact Azure landing zones? So what is a landing zone? Landing zone is actually the output of a multi-subscription Azure environment, and it's an environment for hosting workloads that is in fact pre-made, pre-provisioned through code. We have numerous scripts for that online on the official Microsoft documentation on GitHub, for Terraform, PowerShell, and ARM templates, and so on. And the point is that we have a secure environment, or actually environment that is at least configured and deployed with the security in mind before we actually start moving anything in Azure. So the landing zone, I would say, it's like a cushion for our on-premises or the infrastructure or the services that we will move. So they move in an environment that is already set up, that has some prerequisites, and that will serve as a framework, for example, to move whatever we are moving into Azure. So the point is that we have at least something configured before we move there. So at the start, we are a little bit more secure. It is not just about security; it's also about the performance, about the cost, and so on. But there is no single, of course, a solution for a landing zone that covers all environments. But we have a different. We have an extensive documentation that is covering these, and our landing zones can have actually two flavors. Can come with two types. We have a platform landing zones and application landing zones, and as the name implies, the subscription that are deployed to a platform landing zone, it's a normal environment. It's nothing special. It's not special service. Actually, it's what we deployed to accommodate the migration. So that platform landing zone should provide centralized service that is often operated by a central team to accommodate all functions, networking, identity, storage, data, and so on, that will be used by different workloads and applications. And these are are fundamental landing zones that represent the landing zone for the key services that will be moved to Azure. And then we have application landing zones that also we have a subset of these, like workload application landing zones and technology platforms and centrally managed ones. And these are one more subscriptions depending on your environment that is deployed as an environment for an application or for a specific app workload. And these application landing zones are placed in different management groups, for example, like production or app or data or corporation or online or whatever it is beneath the actual landing zones management group. So we are in fact also accommodating for policy controls and for these policy controls to be correctly applied after we move our services. And then we have a centrally managed one, for example, where the team, the IT team applies controls and platform tools to both of these platform and application landing zones, for example. And then we have smaller ones that host like different technology platforms like Kubernetes services and so on. And then the workloads where we have different tiers like backend tiers, data tiers, infrastructure tiers, and so on. So these zones, in fact, can be deployed by using Microsoft has a landing zone portal accelerator, and we can use these. It means what it is. It is the ARM templates that are pre-created, and we can find in various places different templates, whether it's ARM or Terraform templates, all around places. So this one is, for example, one example of a landing zone of this architecture. This is easily obtainable from the Microsoft website. There's also the very convenient Visio file that you can use, which is very handy because Visio is a great product and it has not just fancy graphics, but it also has attributes and possibility to export these and making reports and so on. So it just it is the product beyond just the graphics. So this one, sorry, this one landing zone architecture is just sample one. We might have bigger or larger or smaller, but this one actually has a management group and subscription organization in the middle, where we have identity landing zone, we have a different connectivity landing zone subscriptions and management ones, as well as the one for the core services. That will be the one with the letter F, for example, and so on. And then we have the testing as well, sandbox subscriptions, etc. We might not have the need for everything, but the point is that we are creating the framework to load and to accommodate our services, products that we will move from on premises or from wherever. That could be a different cloud or AWS or GCP or another Azure subscription tenant, for example, and so on. So this is just one example of it. What else? Yes, there we have one example of network architecture with the hub and spoke, for example, that was chosen for as a landing zone, where we have on-premises sites and different VPN clients, and then we are at the start defining the different management groups. That would be the hub management or non-production or production, or like in the previous slide, we've seen also the sandboxing environment with the specific subscriptions and so on. And that includes also the policies, naming, tagging, different restrictions that should be placed onto these management groups via policies, for example, an ability to use specific virtual machine SKUs or web application SKUs, restricting access to some resources. So when you move the appropriate service or product, then you will be ready, and that product will be more secure actually, and ready for more ready for production, let's say. So for example, when we describe and define the management groups roughly, then we can go and figure out the subscriptions. That could be, here are just 3, one in each management group, but we can have more, and that is what landing zones actually are served for. So we are planning upfront and then creating that landing zone, and then move the services there. So the resource group, for example, the non-production subscription here has 2, while the other ones have only 1. And after that, we design from the top to bottom the different virtual networks, subnets, and so on, connections, network security groups, application security groups, as well as any monitoring or SIEM or any products that we should place there, as well as the ports that should be open, etc. And again, and then we finally, when we are ready, then we can move, actually connect and make the transition to move our services to what we already prepared. There are a few baselines for the migration security, and that we should take care of and think up front. There are few things. Network security essentials for migration identity concerns, then data security within migration, and the last 2, asset management security and logging. And first of all, the network security, which we need to think about in migrating, is that will assist us, of course, and that we should think about implementing as Azure Private Link or private endpoints, and disabling some public network access in this case. So first of all, we need to ensure that the data is intact, in fact, and that the data is not sniffed upon anyone and looked upon. So we can use very versatile and very good Azure Private Link private endpoints solution. So we are deploying private endpoints for all the we can deploy these private endpoints for all the resources that actually support the private link feature to establish secure connection for the resources. And this private link and private endpoint means that we can integrate easily with on-premises, with peer networks. It supports the migration to securely discover, assess, and migrate servers over a private network, for example, while providing a secure encrypted protection against any data exfiltration, for example. And we can use the and connect privately and securely via other things, for example, like using VPN connection, express route, and so on. But in this case, the private link feature is the one that we should use. And the private link, in fact, is enables us to access the platform as a services, like, for example, storage database, and in a secure way. So the private link has different benefits. We can access privately services on Azure platform. We can extend our own services. We have a global reach with these services, protects against data leakage, because it's the private endpoint that we map to a past resource instance. It is encrypted. We can connect to on-premises and peer networks, so via express route or VPN or peered networking, and of course it's global reachable, so we can in fact connect privately to services that are running in other regions as well, so they don't have to be in the same one. And of course we can privately access services on Azure platform, so this can be used to all services that can be used in different application components, for example. What else do we have? We have the private endpoints, which is in connection to the private link. It is just a network interface, in fact, that uses a private IP address from the network, and then this is the interface that you connect privately and securely to a service that private link provides. And we enable the private endpoint. When we enable it, then we can bring that service into our network, and it's a secure one. The services can be the database services, for example, Cosmos DB storage, and so on, for example. And if we have our own service, then we can use the private link, for example, which is the requirement for the also using this is the subset of it. Then we have the possibility to use also, well, not the possibility, we should plan for security in identity as well, and that means that we should plan for security, meaning whenever it's possible, we should use the Azure AD authentication, because it provides the seamless integration, and it's more secure than other options. It's integrated. Azure Migrates actually takes advantage of it, and of managed identities of service principal in Azure Active Directory, and for specific operations. And also Azure Migrate supports the Azure Active Directory for as a user access control. Then we have to, we should use managed identities. The managed identities, in fact, are identities, specific service endpoints that can be of two flavors, actually two types. We can have a user managed identity and a system managed identity, and these managed identities, in fact, instead of run service principal, we should use them whenever possible. It means that we can securely authenticate to Azure services to Azure Active Directory. That, of course, for the ones that support Azure Active Directory. And the managed identity credentials are fully managed by Azure Active Directory, actually by the platform. And these are specific service principal identities that are tied to life cycle of a resource that they are created for. So when we enable managed system managed identity on a resource, the Azure Fabric creates the adjacent entry in the Azure Active Directory and ties it to a life cycle, actually to the referenced to the service that we created it for, and it manages authentication and rotation, and also the life cycle of it. So when we create the resource, when we delete the resource that was created, that the managed identity was created for, also that entry in Azure Active Directory for that resource is created, is deleted as well. So in very simple terms, that will be that will look like this. So if we let's take a storage example here, or a virtual machine, whatever it is. Let's take one just for the example, a virtual machine. We have a test virtual machine here, and all the products and resources that support these have the identity placeholder here. Here is the system assigned identities already created. So how it looks when it doesn't have anything. So this one, for example, doesn't have anything here in identity. This very simple one. So we're just click away. So yeah, this one as well. Nevertheless, so what we are doing here, we are clicking on and saving. When it's done, then the object principal ID that is unique for that resource is created in an Azure Active Directory, to which we can, in fact, then add specific Azure role assignments, and we can reference that object ID anywhere where the reference is supported, for example, Key Vaults or elsewhere. So when we delete the resource, that object principal ID is deleted as well. So we are more secure. And then we have, for example, if we need to support the migration for different scenarios, we might also use in parallel to that user assigned managed identity, which is similar to what we've seen, but the goods that are created are standalone. These are have a separate life cycle from the resources to which they are attached. They are standalone, and we are using, let's say, managed identities, where there they are. Managed identities are here. We have one created that I've used recently. So when we created this one, we can reference any service, this to any service that it supports, like Key Vault I said in the previous example, and we can see the associated resources where this managed identity is being used. So when we delete, for example, this test VM1 or any resource that is attached to the managed identity, user managed identity, that specific managed identity, in case this one is not deleted but it's retained, and we can reuse it. So it means better security, because we are not defining security for and access controls for every resource that we create, but just for this one, for which we know what it does, where it's being used, and which services or products are used with, and we can reuse it, what's more important, and change it at one place. So when we change it in one place, for example, if we given the permission to this managed identity on a Key Vault, changing the permission on a Key Vault will change all the permissions to all resources that are associated. So with potentially one click, we are changing the permissions and access policies, for example, for all the virtual machines that are assigned to this that this managed identity is assigned to. So it's a very convenient way and secure way to use the authentication that managed user managed identities and system managed identities provide. Then the service credentials and secrets that support integration and storage in Azure Key Vault should be used, and that is mandatory. That should be mandatory, and that should be that is what any good security or savvy admin should think of. So we shouldn't expose our keys or secrets anywhere at any time. So it is not just the best practice to use it when migrating things, but it is the best practice to use it everywhere where we can use the keys and certificates and secrets that can be stored and referenced in a Key Vault, because it provides the most secure way to store the secrets there. That no one can access without being authenticated and authorized. Just one example or a table that says a little bit more about our managed identities, and the difference is very obvious. So these can't be shared and these can, and so on, like we've mentioned it previously and saw it in an example. The key vault, on the other hand, is a one of the different key management solutions in Azure. It actually helps solving different problems in management of keys, certificates, and secrets. That's the main use. It supports these three distinct management features. It can be used to store securely and control access to tokens, passwords, API keys, and the other secrets. It can be used like a key management solution. It makes it very easy to create and control the encryption keys. That means for example, disk encryption keys, VM encryption keys, or database encryption keys, and so on. And as well, it's also very versatile way, a service that can help us to provision, manage, deploy the TLS certificates, for example, for use with Azure internal connected resources. So, and it comes with two service tiers. The one that is a standard, which has which encrypts with a software key, and there is a premium one, which also includes hardware security module protected keys. These are protected by Thales hardware security module, very secure, and very popular and used across, well, all over the world in different situations. Why we should use it? First of all, it's the best, well, one of the best ways to use it and to protect our secrets. To centralize the storage of application and secrets in key vault, and also furthermore, we can tightly and fine-grainedly control the distribution of the secrets and keys and certificates. So it greatly in fact minimizes the chances so that any secrets can be accidentally leaked, whether it's a DevOps solution or it's a database encryption or disk encryption. It is very versatile. So the point is, we don't have to, when using the key vault, we don't have to store security information in apps or config files. So even if these files or apps are being leaked or abused or breached, there is no information other than an endpoint, or actually a pointer to the place where the key is and stored, and that is in a key vault. So no one until the successful authentication and authorization can access the key. And that also applies to the store secrets, to the and certificates, and so on. And what's even better, we can we can and we should monitor access and use of that while we are migrating, and while after the migration as well. So once we created one key vault or different key vaults, we should create different key vaults for different purposes. Why? Because the key vaults also have their own RBAC access controls, and these key vaults can be then also more granularly given access to. So just to take an overview of a key vault, this key vault, for example, is a premium one, and we can have our access to the key vault or a permission model configured as a vault access policy, which is the default one, and the role-based access control. My personal preference is vault access policy because these access policies give more granular, permissions to the key vault, and we can specifically include which key, secret, or certificate permissions will be allowed, or operations will be allowed for a given service principal, and for the application, for example, at the end. And here we have one very nice example when where the system managed identities have been used to give access to resources to, for example, to key given key permissions, and after the resources that have been given these permissions to access the key in this key vault have been deleted, the reference UID in Azure Active Directory doesn't exist anymore, so that's why we have unknown here, so we can easily and very nicely delete these two because we don't need them anymore. So there's still one. I'll just leave it for the reference. And the key vault, if you haven't been using it, you should, because it is the ultimately the most secure way to secure the keys. And then a few things about data security and protection. The data should be encrypted in transit. So the data should be encrypted in transit. And what does it mean? It means that our data in transit is enabled in Azure by default, but if we need to transfer the data more securely, then we either use the public endpoint, the private links, private endpoints, VPNs, and this more secure way, for example, Azure Express route. I had a client that hadn't been using the VPN to move the data, and it used the Azure files, and this has been, or some other things have been also in place that led at the end for the data to be leaked. So we should use very secure VPN connection, or at least TLS 1.2 protocol now. That is the more secure one. The obsolete SSL or TLS 1.0, 1.1 versions and protocols should be disabled here and not used. Data at rest is natively supported in Azure, but that doesn't include other things like in our cases, for example, SQL databases, transparent data encryption, or data masking, for example. That is also very useful, and we should think about that as well. And although not by default, we should also encrypt all the data for the disks, for example, that we used to migrate. According to some studies and researches, more than 70% of the data is leaked by malicious insiders. So if we have a rogue admin, for example, that wants to take our data out, that has access to the disks, these disks are encrypted at rest. That means on the platform in the Azure data center on their physical disks, but that doesn't provide us with a security when that ISO file or Azure disk is moved out of the subscription. So that's where we need to use also the disk encryption as well. And eventually customer managed keys, for example, if we have more sensitive data, for example. But one caveat, as we use our own key, then we are responsible for management, storage, for securing that key as well, because Microsoft cannot help us retrieve or decrypt our data if we lose that key, and that happened before a lot of times. So unfortunately, a lot of security researchers, me too, as well, are bound by non-disclosure agreements, and that is unfortunate thing, because I think if there are really more information about the leaks, about the bad things that happen because of the bad security, I think it will raise the awareness of at the companies, at the persons, to think a little bit more stronger and more harder on how to secure their data, because the data leaks happen daily, and you'll be surprised how easy it is to do that if you don't implement all the security measures. And implementation of the basic security measures, that gives you almost 90, I would say 95, 99% of the protection are easy. Data encryption, key vault, multi-factor authentication, private links, and so on. You're then much better protected than you haven't compared to what you've been before. Customer managed keys, we mentioned these as well, and also the key vault for protecting these keys should be used. That means secure key management process means we should use the key vault in here. And for the last part, we have the asset management and logging. That asset management and logging should be also used. What does it mean? So asset management means that we should use only approved services, and for that we should use Azure policies. So these Azure policies should be used and configured in a way that particular subscriptions, users, landing zones can use only approved services, and other services or SKUs should be locked, for example, and not allowed to be used. And not just for the security purposes, but also for expenditure as well, because at the end, everything we touch in every cloud, not just in Azure, we will pay for. So we need to first of all stay secure, because if we are able to create, if anyone is able to create any service in the wild, then this can be after that exploited, and things can go wrong very rapidly in the cloud, because we can have numerous services created at once, and after we created it, no one actually knows for what purpose are they used, and so on. For example, if you create a virtual machine, and if you don't restrict who can do what in a subscription or in a management group or a resource group, the typical number of resources that are created with a virtual machine is from 5 to 10, and on average. And imagine that you have an environment that you have a number of users that can do that and create a number of resources or VMs. Then you're up to hundreds or thousands of artifacts or services created in a subscription or in a resource group, and that is the security, a very serious security issue. So we should implement some policies to protect and to restrict what can be used. Also, the security, once we deploy that, or actually before we deployed it in Azure Landing Zones, the Defender for Cloud also should be used at least to implement some security baselines, for example, to enforce some baseline security configurations of the Azure resources. And also, we should use the Azure Monitor to create alerts where there are any configuration changes, for example, or deviations, or any unsupported resource creations. And of course, we need to specify also some alerts. So it's not just enough to use the monitor, but in fact, proper alerting should be in place. Logging for security investigation means that we should use Azure Resource Logs. But not only that, we should place, first of all, we should place them somewhere that where we can reference to them after the retention period, after the period of where these logs or information are displayed by default in Azure. That means some log analytics workspaces and or Azure storage. And in Azure storage, we can secure these and move to a different tier, to an archive tier or to a cool tier, for example, for archival. But it should be placed, for example, in stream in the log analytics workspace, where we can analyze these further with some SIEM solution, for example, with a Sentinel, or analyzed manually. But in that case, we also need to configure the specific retention on that log analytics workspace. But that's not all. We need to also collect enough data, or not just enough data, but the right data. Since we have the possibility to collect a lot of different types of data and informational warning messages with higher or lower sensitivity or alertness, we need to identify what is really important and start with these, and gradually expand the collection of what we collect, and then also implement some alerting as well. That will be in rough what we need to think upfront when we migrate. So at the end, what we've seen and what we need to think upfront. So we mentioned Azure landing zones. We have to create these in a very secure way, and we have to think upfront and create these landing zones in a secure way, and incorporate the policy, implement the correct policies as well to restrict and secure our environment upfront before migrating anything. And also think about these 5 things when migrating. Network security, which is the private link, private endpoints, and disabling public access for the services that support that. Use the integration whenever possible, and identity security management, which includes, in fact, our Azure Active Directory, required authentication, managed identities, and at the end we had data security protection, and that would be encrypting sensitive data in transit and using key vault. You'll be surprised how many a lot of customers that migrate don't use these things, or what's even worse, don't use these things properly, because if they use them using these but not properly gives you false sense of security, and then it's even highly likely that you actually miss something, and especially if you don't monitor. So usually the monitoring starts and logging starts at the very end for the most customers, and I should say we should do that immediately as we migrate resources, because if we don't monitor from the very start, we will lose the monitoring data. So what passes, we can't get back in time and retrieve the metric or the data, what happened. So if we don't start logging and monitoring from the very beginning, we might miss something, and that would be either misconfiguration or performance issues, or what's even worse, we might miss some security security breaches or some security problems that arise there. So although it shouldn't be implemented, the logging and security should be also one of the first things that we should think up front.